Hi everyone, how are you today? I'm really excited to answer your questions today, and my apologies that it has taken so long to get this video made. I have like half a dozen excuses that all sound really good in my head, but I think would no doubt sound very lame if I spoke them out loud. So all I can say is thanks for your patience. This is going to be a long video, so let's not waste any time and we'll just get straight into these questions that you guys sent in. All right, so first question. What does a rite entail and what is it attempting to accomplish? What happens when a rite goes wrong? Good question. So first we have to understand what a rite is. And one of the ways we could think about that is we could say that a rite is essentially a symbol in action. It's like the encoded essence of something divine and supernatural. And, you know, there is a way in which the god that a particular rite was associated with is non-different from the rite itself on a metaphysical level. So in that sense, participating in a rite was bringing oneself into association with the god. The ritual brings the god into the room, but it's not that you're lowering the god to the earthly plane, but rather you're raising your own consciousness up to their level through this ritual participation. So this is not the same thing as summoning a lower entity and binding them to your will. The gods are not forced to come, but they choose to because they take an interest in someone who has raised their consciousness, and it's beneficial for them to do so because the person performing the rite is reinvigorating them. So through this higher divine will, you're harmonized with the gods. You're joining their chorus, so to speak, and the divine is arranging for you to participate in that song. This ritual is transforming you and your environment in such a way that it rises up to the heavens, metaphysically speaking, I should say, and then the gods are able to interact with you. So this interaction is a completely spiritual affair, and the regular performance of rituals was a cornerstone to every aspect of life in a traditional civilization. Well, what happens when you enter into regular association with the gods? It's the same thing that happens when you spend a lot of time with a particular friend. You know, you become more like them. But the gods are pure, so you have to first be pure yourself to enter into that association with them, which is why purification is one of the major elements of rituals. If you've purified your consciousness, which will be reflected also in the purity of your body, and you're manifesting divine attributes within yourself, then the gods will want to hang out with you and they'll welcome you into their club. And furthermore, regular contact with the divine will cause you to lose your taste for material things. You'll lose your attraction to things of a low level of consciousness, like lust or gluttony, and you gain the ability of renunciation and to resist temptations. Ritual was not intended to harness the power of the gods and force them to serve material human desires, but rather for humans to be able to align with the divine will and transcend the human state. Now, Evola does mention that the gods bowed before the priestly caste, and the reason for this is because they do depend on these rites and they need someone to perform them. If the god is non-different from their rites and no one performs the rites, then, what happens to the god? I mean, we could speculate on that. Maybe the god ceases to exist as an individual entity. Maybe they fall into a slumber if someone isn't regularly prodding at them. Who knows? Maybe that's the reason that the gods have gone silent. There's nobody to perform their rites and reawaken them anymore. So, this invocation of the gods was extremely powerful. So there were some dangers. And if a ritual went wrong, you were literally putting your soul on the line. An incorrectly performed rite was a sacrilege. It wounded the avatar of the god. It's disharmonious with the divine order, and it's essentially invoking chaos. You're opening the gates to all that which is opposed to the divine order. So a rite had to be done perfectly, or there could be major spiritual blowback because these are really powerful forces. I remember reading at one point something about a rite having to be abandoned because a bird had flown into the temple, hit the wall, and dropped dead, and this was just considered a terrible omen, that it had contaminated the rite and it just had to be stopped. So, I mean, that's an example right there of not even, not incorrectly performing the rite, but something coming in from the outside that's contaminating that environment. So, when you invite those forces of chaos, sometimes you might end up summoning something really evil. But when these rituals were done with the right consciousness, the right attitude, the right understanding, then the gods would actually appear and the participants would be elevated through it. All right, next question. Why can't plebs partake in rites? This is a really good question, especially for the modern era, I think, because so many people are brought up with this mentality that, everyone should get a fair go. You should be able to prove yourself through merit. And so this idea that only a certain class could have access to the wisdom and the power of the rites doesn't sit well with a lot of modern people. So the reason for this is for the same reason that a non-initiated noble cannot take part in them. Rites simply aren't meant for everyone, and there has been an admixture of the castes now, but it used to be that most people of the priestly caste would have had a suitable nature for initiation into the rites, whereas most people of the lower castes would not have. And the reason is that the nobility were descended from divine ancestors and could claim a blood connection to the gods whose rites they were performing, whereas the lower classes had no divine ancestors. You need that ancestral connection to the god as just a basic requirement, and then you still need to undergo initiation on top of it. So it wasn't even enough to be born into that caste. You still had to prove yourself. Now, if you had a divine and regal lineage somewhere in your ancestry, then initiation would awaken whatever latent seed you had within you. But if you didn't have that ancestry, then there's really nothing for initiation to awaken. The seed for that particular flowering just isn't there. So it's not a case of meritocracy or intelligence, but of lineage. These aren't, they're not cultural customs that one can learn. They're related to something very deep and very fundamental within the blood of a particular stock. So the reality was that, even if you gave the lower classes a chance to prove themselves, the vast majority wouldn't have been able to achieve any great heights through the rites and most likely would have corrupted it, which was exactly what happened to a lot of the Roman mystery schools when the plebs started agitating to be allowed to join. It's like how the early Buddhists didn't allow women to join. Would there maybe be the occasional woman who could overcome her material limitations and achieve liberation? Possibly yes, but you don't let in 1,000 women who will fail and potentially corrupt the tradition just to let in the one woman who might succeed. And this is obviously at odds with the modern egalitarian mindset, but it's important to remember that hierarchy is foundational to the divine order and therefore to tradition. And so there were clear protocols in place for this hierarchy, which worked very well in a time when the castes had not yet become degenerated and mixed up. All right, here's a really good question that quite a few people have asked. Why were spiritual ties more important than blood in regards to both families and civilizations? So it's really a question of which one has primacy. Both were important. It's not that the spiritual tie negates the blood tie in any way, just that it has primacy over it. So the blood tie is still important, and the ideal circumstance would be for families and civilizations to have both blood and spiritual connections. But in circumstances where you don't have both, then Evola says that the spiritual tie is more important. So, for example, if you were to have a friend who you consider to be a comrade who sees the world in the same way that you do, and he shares your values and your priorities, And you also have a blood brother who's the complete opposite of you and exemplifies everything that you're against. You know, you'll probably feel like your friend is a lot closer to you than your brother, and you might even feel like your brother is a total stranger, you know, despite growing up together in the same family. And in this way, a spiritual connection takes primacy over a blood connection. It's not that you don't love or care about your biological brother, but, you know, you'd probably rather spend time with your friend. And I think, you know, we probably all have people in our lives that we feel closer to than some of our blood relatives. You know, I think ideally a family would have that same spiritual camaraderie. And so the blood connection and the spiritual connection would then be aligned. But if you feel like a black sheep in your own family, yet you have close friends who are just, you know, they're just vibing on your level, then that's kind of an example of that. As for civilizations, one could argue that any nation that would try to incorporate people who are too different is doomed to fail because the spiritual connection won't be there. To a point, you could incorporate new people into an empire if they're spiritually compatible, but only up to a point. If spirituality becomes too divergent, it will fail. And the kind of multiculturalism we live under today, you know, that would just never happen organically. It was forced on us. It wasn't like tribes that are close cousins of each other and have a similar and shared history got brought under one roof over a long period of time. It was forced on us by elements that actively sought to debilitate and destroy the spiritual core of nations and folk. It was meant to weaken and frustrate that existing spiritual current within societies. So again, you know, we're back to the issue of primacy. You can find examples all over the world of people who are split along religious lines and see themselves as totally separate people, despite being part of the same ethnic group. They might even be, you know, genetically identical to each other, but they hate each other, and you know, they've formed separate communities and in some cases separate nations. So that's an example of that. What are downward paths of transcendence, and why doesn't Evola consider them as legitimate spiritual paths? What difference does it make what kind of transcendence it is? Great question. I think we first have to clarify what we mean here by transcendence. This is a word that we use a lot in the series and that Evola uses a lot in his books, so we should all be on the same page with this term for purposes of discussion. Transcendence means to go beyond by rising. And when we say we want to transcend, we mean that we want to go beyond our earthly, material, temporal existence, but also go above it. And there are a lot of ways to go beyond ordinary existence, but not all of them involve a going upwards. It's that going upwards, that rising, that actually defines transcendence. So for the sake of clarification here, let's say that Evola is exclusively concerned with upward transcendence. This upward transcendence is what leads towards God. Think of it as moving towards the heavens, towards the sky, towards what is above. Well, Aldous Huxley referred to three types of transcendence: upward, downward, and lateral. And Evola references this in The Bow and the Club, and I believe we mentioned it in the relevant episode too. So downward transcendence means to move away from God. Think of this alternate and opposite motion as going downwards, away from the celestial realms, into the earth, into materiality, into abyssal, infernal, subterranean forces. So there's some elemental symbolism involved here. The sky, the heavens, the air is masculine in the very broadest sense of the word, while the earth and matter and all that is part of creation is feminine. And it's also important to note that the ancients thought of everything in material creation as being feminine, which gives you an idea of how broad these terms are when we use them in the context of the world of tradition. We're not using them in the modern sense of very strict biological gender categories here. We're using them in a much more symbolic sense. So upward transcendence tends to be more active, while downward transcendence tends to be more passive. And maybe that's why we tend to see more people drawn to these downward paths in an age where everything and everyone has become overly feminized. The upwardly oriented paths They all have rules about how you use your lower energies. They all teach that you need to learn to control them and transmute them into something higher, and not just engage in the animalistic indulgence of sense pleasures. So you'll find rules regarding celibacy or fasting and certain dietary restrictions or requirements for certain prayers or meditations or rites. There's an ascesis built into these upward paths because that's what allows you to learn to control and ultimately not be enslaved by your material senses, so that you can learn to see what's beyond that. You know, you can't see or experience God when you're in the grips of the illusion of the material world. It's just too intoxicating. If you think that this world is what's ultimately real, then you're blind to what lies beyond, which, you know, that isn't to say that this world is bad or anything. It's like, you know, hey, there's this world, which is really cool and fun, but if you call within the next 30 minutes, there's more. It's my little infomercial for transcendence. So, you know, downward paths do the opposite. They revel in that materiality, and it tends to take the form of the worship of these abyssal and chaotic forces, including the naturalistic elements of the earth. And that's not to say that they're worshiping Satan or anything, but remember that order is represented by the masculine and chaos is represented by the feminine. It's a lot like the New Age scene today, which is very much dominated by feminine energy. They always want to talk about being goddesses and worship Shakti, which is feminine chaos and power, but they never want to talk about Lord Shiva, who grounds Shakti and channels that raw power into something constructive rather than destructive. In many cases, you know, they avoid talking about God at all. They'll talk about, the universe and energies and the source, but never God. Their version of God is this unformed God, and it's a rebellion against order. They're seeking expressions of God that have less order to them. And, you know, to what end do they want to harness these energies? Usually it's to enhance their own personal power, to strengthen their own ego, make money. It's not usually to get closer to the divine. And, you know, that's not to say that there aren't people in the New Age community who are genuinely seeking something divine, but they're going in the opposite direction from where they want to go. And, you know, various factors may contribute to their ignorance about that. Some of that is just that upwardly oriented paths are just not really that common in the Kali Yuga, and especially not in the Western world. So, you know, I can forgive people for ending up on that path while they're just looking for something to give them meaning. But, you know, it's often a case where they don't believe in supernatural or they do believe in supernatural forces, but they don't necessarily believe in an all-encompassing hierarchy that unites the universe. They take their modern prejudices of egalitarianism and they apply it to spirituality. And so they can't really have a God because that automatically creates a hierarchy. So instead, they pretend that, oh, we're all God. And this is just a strengthening of the ego and of illusion, and that ultimately takes you further away from God. You know, that said, the New Age expression of this is just a modern one, and these downward paths trace their roots back to ancient times with the cult of the mother, which we'll get more into in the second half of the book. For those who want to read ahead, you can certainly do that. It's very interesting chapters. I'm looking forward to doing those episodes. But we can even speak of this downward transcendence in terms of primitive tribal spiritualities like shamanism. Again, we see that descent into matter. It's the drawing of the consciousness downward into the collective and subpersonal. It's focused on an ecstasy that's still ultimately derived from the sensory material world. It's this going outward into materiality and collectivism rather than the ecstasy of going inwards. And so it's still very chaotic and chthonic and going into the subterranean realms rather than the heavenly one. So again, there is still something taking you out of your ordinary day-to-day existence. And maybe you could call that transcendence, but it's not that upward path that Evola is concerned with, the path that is going beyond by rising. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, this one's a bit of a technical question. Can you please explain the numen? Are the gods the numen, or are they different? Well, the numen is a bit of a tricky concept because it's very abstract. So if you don't understand it completely, don't feel bad, because it does take a little bit of thinking about in order to grasp it. So Evola describes the numen as a sheer power that is capable of producing effects, acting, and of manifesting itself. And he says that these powers, or noumena, are something simultaneously transcendent and immanent, and they constitute the substance of the original experience of the sacred. It's a supernatural energy, but not a being, and perhaps unconscious and not self-aware. So he contrasts this to the notion of Deus, which is like a personified God. So whether you think of Jesus or Odin or Krishna or whatever, these are all examples of Deus, or personified gods. They have names, they have attributes, they have personalities, etc. But that doesn't really help us grasp what the numen is fundamentally, and it's important to understand this because many of the rites acted upon and interacted with the numen. So imagine that there's an unformed well of spiritual material, like a liquid, and then that liquid can rise up and take forms into individual personified deities, the Deus. And these deities are the personified, self-aware outgrowths from the supernatural energy. But that energy doesn't have a morality attached to it because it's just an energy. It does have certain laws that govern it, but it's not an ethos. Ethos can be attributed to the Deus, and this is why Evola said that prayers may as well be said to a machine. You need an awakened and self-aware God in order for it to respond to a prayer and to care about you, because the numen can't care about you any more than electricity cares about you. So when you do the ritual, you act upon the numen. So let's say it's a mass of clay, and you've got the gods growing up out of it. If you take the wet clay and you kind of mold it and make little figures out of it and stuff, the part of the god that's being acted upon during the ritual is the part where the god's body is blending into the numen. So where the god, your little god figure in the clay, is still blended into the lump. You haven't formed their feet yet or something, right? And so the ritual is kind of touching the roots of the god. The god is not unaware of the ritual effect upon itself, but there is a remnant of it that is still unaware. And, it's kind of like saying, as a person grows older, they develop new traits, but the old traits remain in them too, and they remember these things. And so the numen from which the god grew is still present and attached to it. And it's the subconscious level of the god where the numen connects. If the god was swimming in a pool and you wanted to warm the god up, you could warm up the water. So the god is connected to the numen like a flower growing out of the soil. You want the flower to grow, you act upon the roots in the soil. That's the numen. So this is the distinction between numen and Deus, and this is why rituals act upon the numen, because this is how you sort of prod the god to wake up and take notice. And it might be a bit of a cartoonish way of looking at it, but the concept is what's important. And the god is both simultaneously part of the unformed numen, but also an entity in its own right. So hopefully that makes sense. I threw a lot of analogies at you guys in the hopes that one of them will stick and it will make sense to you, and you can kind of use that to conceptualize the numen. But as I said, it is a tricky concept, so you might need to think about it a little bit, or even go back and read that chapter. I certainly had to think about it quite a bit myself. So all right. Is it bad to return to your ancestors in the afterlife? The idea of returning to one's ancestors in the afterlife is probably the source of the second biggest misunderstanding people had from season 2, I would have to say. So just to recap, we talked about the path of the gods and the path of the ancestors, where the path of the gods leads one into the celestial heavenly realms, and the path of the ancestors just leads you back into dissolution in the totem. And I think naturally we all think of our ancestors as people we would want to know and honor, and therefore the idea of returning to them in the afterlife is an alluring concept. Reuniting with family, meeting the great souls that you're descended from. It's a very romantic and sentimental idea. But if you really want to honor your ancestors, you want to make the heroic leap for them by taking the path of the gods and becoming everything you can be. Don't just sink back into that samsaric churning of the totem. They want you to be all you can be. This redeems your family line. It's said in the Vedas that if one achieves this sort of Olympian immortality, your whole family for several generations forward and back will get a seat at the table with you in the celestial realms. So when you make that leap, then you are with your ancestors, but you're with the ancestors who were heroic and who approached godliness in their lives. You're with the greatest ones. So, would you rather be with your normie ancestors or the godly heroic ones? If you make the leap, you also uplift your common ancestors who didn't quite make it themselves, but who still tried to live greater virtuous lives, and they're in your immediate lineage. You lift them up too. So this is the most noble way to serve your ancestors, to do something divinely heroic on their behalf. It's like they're trapped in a kind of purgatory, and you lift them up to heaven. Would you rather jump into the pit with them to keep them company, or throw a ladder down to them so they can escape? Which do you think they would prefer, especially if they knew you were capable of more and they're desperately trying to stir you through your blood and soul to be more? They'd be really disappointed in you. It should be the greatest of your ancestors that you want to serve, impress, and emulate. The Vedas also say that those who take the path of the moon, that is the path of the ancestors, become food for the gods. And in fact, many traditions believed that if you hadn't developed yourself spiritually, your soul in the afterlife couldn't ascend any higher than the moon, which is the celestial sphere closest to the earth. The Buddha would say that all that survives are sankharas, just cravings and aversions, various personal aggregates that have nothing to do really with you as an individual. These things become daemons, and your personal daemon wants to help lift you up so that it too can be free. You're composed of all these material cravings and aversions, but also a higher impulse. And if you never overcome your cravings and aversions, those by definition end up being the dominant elements of your existence, the things that define you. So that's all you end up being in the afterlife because, that's kind of all you ever were. That's the shadow life you live in. And most people never escape it. I mean, this might be why in so many traditions, most people were thought to go into this shadowy realm after death where they eventually just fade into nothingness. So, whatever impulse you had to escape those sankharas, it's possible that this higher element of you could have some period of time after death where, there's a great revealing that occurs, where you come to see the things that imprisoned you, where you can see your life in its full contrast, and you would know in that observation that you didn't do what you needed to do. You only functioned at this lower level, and those who have done very little development on themselves would be so overcome by the experience of death, and their mind would be so clouded over that they don't even get the chance to think about their life. You have to be a thinker in this life if you want to be a thinker in the afterlife, and you have to be heroic in this life to be heroic in the next. And so I think for those of you who are, saying, oh, I'd rather just go be with my ancestors, I mean, think about what it would mean to your ancestors if you actually made that celestial leap and they got to go with you. It's not a great fate to take the path of the ancestors, spiritually speaking. So there's that. Can you explain exactly what the daemon is and how it is related to the totem? This is really closely related to the previous question, and I normally would combine questions like that into one, but these are kind of technical concepts, so it's important to understand them well, I think. So I thought it merited its own discussion. And now, if you recall back to the chapter, The Two Paths on the Afterlife, Evola remarks that the idea that everyone has an immortal soul is rather odd, and he says this isn't a belief that was found in the traditional world. He says they made a distinction between true immortality, which would be making that Olympian leap into the afterlife to join the gods, and, just mere survival. So if you don't make that leap, there is no eternal afterlife for you, and this is what most ancient cultures believed in various forms. So this concept of the daemon, or the double, is what most people are actually referring to when they think about a soul. But this entity itself is not immortal, and it's not sufficient to house consciousness after death. It's essentially just an entity of craving. Evola describes the daemon as the deep force that originally produced consciousness within the body that it's residing in during its time in the material world. And it's this force that will remain behind when the individual dies. He says that the daemon was closely associated with the totem, the unitary life force that gives rise to a particular stock or tribe and is unique to them. So if you remember before how we spoke about the numen and how the gods are related to the numen, they can rise up out of it as individual personified beings, but they're still connected to it at the roots and eventually go back into it. You can use those same analogies for thinking about the relationship between the totem and the daemon almost. So everybody in your family, for example, are individual emanations from the same totem. Your ancestors and your descendants are also emanations from that totem. And so the totem produces these daemons that bring an animating conscious force to people as individuals. But, it's not a soul. But, what happens when these people die? Everything that is material about a person, none of that is ever immortal. This sense of I that we have in our waking state, everything that makes us feel like an individual person, whether that be our bodies or our psychology or particular preferences and quirks, that's all going to disappear upon death. And some people's sense of I will emanate a shadow for a time after death, but even that too eventually fades away. So everything that makes you feel like you as a separate individual being is not something you can plan on taking with you in the afterlife, regardless of your final destination. But the daemon is another story. So the daemon is part of the totem, that vital force of our ancestral stock, which is essentially just on loan to use for the duration of our lives. And when we die, we have to give that back. And so if you failed to make the Olympian leap, that daemon is returned to the totem. You might be thinking, well, doesn't that mean that the daemon is in fact an immortal soul? And that would be a valid question at this point. And I think one that's also emotionally comforting for a lot of people to think of the daemon as a soul. Because the daemon is getting dissolved and reabsorbed back into the collective, infernal, and impersonal totem. We can say on the one hand that it's immortal insofar as the totem is, but on the other hand, it's no longer any kind of individual entity. So have you guys ever seen Star Trek Deep Space Nine? I'm dorkifying myself here because not only am I sitting here geeking out about Evola, now I'm exposing myself as a Trekkie. But if you've ever seen Deep Space Nine, where there's the changeling homeworld, and once the changelings, they turn back into their natural gooey state and they rejoin this ocean of all the other changelings, they're indistinguishable as individuals, and they have to rise up out of the goo and take a form in order to be an individual apart from their collective. So now what you have to keep in mind is that the daemon actually does want to be liberated from the totem. It wants to be free of the infernal realm and join the celestial realm, and it's hoping that you might be a vehicle for it to do that. So practices like astrology in the ancient world were used in part to help a person get to know their personal daemon and grow spiritually. There were also magic rituals designed to directly summon the daemon so that you could do this. And in the Roman world, there was this concept of the dii inferi, or the dii manis, which was essentially the totem. And it was believed that the souls, that is the daemons of those who were deceased, continued to exist in the dii inferi into which they were dissolved, but also in the forces of the stock of the living relatives in which that same totem was being actively manifested. So when you died, you became part of the collective dead. You didn't exist anymore as an individual. And we spoke in episode 7 about the importance of family rites, and this is why they were important, because those rites reinvigorate the totem in the same way that rites for the greater gods reinvigorates them out of the numen. So there's this really deep spiritual and supernatural connection to the dead and to your relatives, and neglecting those rites was harmful to your whole family. But this is also why when you do make that Olympian leap into the afterlife, you liberate your whole family, because in a sense, you are them and they are you. Once you strip away all material individuality, if you make that leap and you gain immortality for your daemon by overcoming, the second death, well, that daemon is intimately bound up with the totem of your family, so they all get to come along for the ride too. Isn't that nice? So yeah, those two questions were kind of similar, but I think the second follows up from the first one pretty well, and hopefully that clarified both of those questions a little bit better. Is the degeneration of race inevitable? So in episode 10, there's a heavy reliance on Arthur de Gobineau's work because Evola drew a lot of influence from him on this topic of civilizational decline. So I do recommend that anyone having trouble coming to terms with the racial concepts to have a read of de Gobineau just to get some context for where Evola's coming from. And while the path of the ancestors question was probably the source of the second biggest misunderstanding in season 2, this question of race most definitely qualifies for number 1. So while de Gobineau does actually say that some racial mixing is not only inevitable but even desirable, we have to remember that when he's talking about races, he's not talking about people in mass forced migration crossing the globe by airplanes. He's talking about the territorial expansion of the empire into its nearest neighbors. And an empire would not want to integrate a people if they felt they were incompatible. Like, Rome didn't really want to integrate the barbarians. They didn't want to expend the effort to bring them under the empire because it wouldn't have been beneficial to have them there. What's the risk to benefit ratio? So forced multiculturalism today isn't considering whether or not this is beneficial because it's harmful and destructive by design. There would never be an empire arising organically that's just, grabbing random people from all over the world and plopping them in one place together. And neither de Gobineau nor Evola could have conceived of such a thing. So we have to be careful to put their ideas into historical context and not project our own modern political biases onto them. Any empire that grows too large will collapse under its own weight, and you could think of some traditional, classical, global empire of the Golden Age where it was so spiritually whole that every people would have come on their knees begging to be brought into the empire. But you can't maintain an empire where you have people still maintaining tribal separation and conflicts within the empire. So Evola and de Gobineau, they could not have fathomed the kind of mass immigration we see today, and they aren't suggesting that these problems will be solved if we all just ethnically intermingle the way the globalists say it will. Evola's even explicitly saying that this ideally shouldn't happen to begin with. But to some extent, the degeneration of race is inevitable, and Evola acknowledges this. Even the sun will one day burn out. Nothing lasts forever. Everything goes through its birth, its seasons, and its death. You could argue that anyone who falls outside the group and chooses to abandon their own race is already the product of a deteriorating age and a sign that their race is losing its luster. The racialist might see this as defeatism, but in the biological sense, nothing is eternal, not even race. Even the gods don't live forever. And that's not to sound defeatist, but, when you think the biological is everything, you can have a really hard time emotionally coping with the idea of impermanence. But everything is subject to that deterioration, which isn't to say you just lie down and give up, because it's not for us to decide when that time is. You bail water and row like crazy and hope you make it to shore, and you fight out of a sacred duty regardless of what you think the outcome might be. So Evola acknowledges this reality, and he's trying to explain how it occurs and what possible outcomes there are, and what things might be a saving grace or a silver lining. And he's saying that the decline of a civilization occurs when the people lose their race of spirit, and that to some degree this is inevitable. And he's saying that if the race of the blood is still pure, then maybe there's a slim chance that the race of spirit could atavistically return and reinvigorate the people. It's kind of the final bulwark against the decline, but pure bloodlines are still doomed to fail without a spiritual reawakening. So focusing on saving only a genetic lineage without any concern for the spiritual is only delaying the inevitable. That spiritual chrism must be reawakened, because without it, a race is just like a hollow shell without any meaningful substance behind it. We have to remember that in a traditional worldview, the material flows from the spiritual, not the other way around. So imagine if you had a huge river that starts out as a tiny little stream, but is a raging, foamy river full of rapids by the time it reaches the ocean. And imagine that the little lake feeding this little stream dries up. It would be a while before you would see the effects at the other end of the river. There's so much water there that it will keep flowing for a while, just with the river getting gradually lower and lower over time. You think that because the river is still flowing at the end that everything's okay. Just like the river can continue to flow for some time after it's disconnected from its source, so too can a race continue to exist even after it's been cut off from its spiritual chrism. But a race that has died spiritually will eventually die materially as well. I did a whole discussion on this on another channel a while back regarding the race of the spirit, and I think I'll drop that link into the description for people. Or the other option he mentions too is that an entirely new race emerges and they're very strong of spirit and can bring that back, which is, it's unlikely, but it's possible. So he's not trying to offer any solutions to this, but he's just explaining what the traditional view of race and nation was and how it is that these things came to wane over time. And he needs to set these concepts up early in the book because it sets the stage for what comes later in the second half. So he's tracing the fall away from the primordial world of tradition to explain how we got to where we are today. And he's not offering his opinion of it. He's just stating the facts as he sees them and saying, this is what happened and why. This is what will happen and why. He's just analyzing the situation. So hopefully that clarifies it, because it's a topic a lot of people misunderstood or took issue with, and Evola's views on this subject are really complex and nuanced. So it's hard to present a summation of it and still stay true to what he's trying to convey. I could spend hours talking about just this one subject alone, but unfortunately I just have the space of this one question to answer it, and I'm trying to keep this video under an hour if possible. So hopefully that is a good enough answer for you guys. I know a lot of you had a question about that, but if it's still unclear, check the link to the other video or just ask in the comments and I'll do my best to answer your questions. All right, I just had a major computer crash, but we're back and everything was saved. So we've got 2 more questions left to go. Fingers crossed that my computer will hold out till then. So next question, how is all this spiritual stuff actually going to help anything in the world? Does Evola actually offer any solutions? That's kind of a nice segue from the previous question, and this is probably one of the most common criticisms we get from people in the comments, so I wanted to address this. It's important to understand that Evola is not in the business of providing socio-political solutions to any of the problems that plague the modern world. He's not going to give you a roadmap to achieve political victory and claim world domination. If that's what you're looking for, then Evola is probably not going to be your cup of tea. So he doesn't really believe that anything can be done to stop the civilizational slide into dissolution, because it's a process that started a long time ago with the progressive loss of the link to the supernatural reality that underpins this world. It's not a question of reversing contingencies like consumerism or technology or whatever other thing a person might try to blame for their degeneracy in society. So he's not offering political solutions because they don't address the fundamental problem that caused the situation in the first place. What he is offering as a potential pathway for remaining standing amidst the ruins of a collapsing, decaying era, so that you might be one of the few who's not pulled under by all the downward forces trying to destroy you. He's offering you a spiritual solution, a way to steel yourself against the onslaught. He says that onslaught is inevitable. What's not decided yet is whether you sink or swim. Now, for people who are deeply attached to outcomes in the material world, this may not resonate. And he's not really intending for his message to resonate with everyone, which isn't to sound elitist, but he does say only a very small minority of differentiated people are the ones who his work is suited for. He's lighting a beacon for those following an Olympian path who want to achieve heroism in the spiritual sense. And it's only when we achieve heroism in the spiritual sense that we have the ability to achieve it through our actions in the material world. So he's placing a focus on non-attachment to this world for the health and sanity of your mind and soul. He's not saying you can't be actively involved in the material world, but if you're too invested in outcomes, you'll just be dragged down by disappointment and frustration and anger and hatred and disillusionment. If you want to act in the world to some extent, you have to maintain a separateness from it so that it can't affect you. Not only can you then remain standing, but you can help others and you can help them find their way out of the darkness too. So the real victory is ultimately the spiritual victory. There are some material benefits to gaining that spiritual victory, but that's not really Evola's focus. All right, final question. The modern man wants to know first and then do, but Evola recommends knowing after doing. Isn't it right to want to know the truth about tradition/belief before committing to something that may be erroneous or ultimately untrue? All right, so first of all, it's not to know after doing, but to know by doing. And there's a difference. The process of doing is what reveals the wisdom. To be able to understand it before committing is akin to apprehending it completely as a rational exercise, which is totally antithetical to this path. But fear not, you don't have to commit to this path for an infinite amount of time before it starts to bear fruits. The wisdom will gradually reward you in stages as you develop on the path. Look, if you don't like it, you can get off at any time. It's not about the destination. There are various stages along the journey that will continuously reveal aspects of the greater picture. It would be like climbing a mountain. You don't have to get to the very top to see a spectacular view of the valley beneath you. Every time you look around on your climb, you're going to be rewarded with a great view as you realize some of that progress. This having been said, if there was a way to apprehend this purely through cognitive processes, there would be nothing wrong with that per se, but it's simply not accessible in that manner. Evola's teachings are the antithesis to all dogmatic thought in that it requires you to develop first-hand insights in order to believe anything. Typically with a dogma, you have to first suspend your disbelief and buy into a viewpoint, and then the fruits are promised to you. In this way, he's also the antidote to dogmatic teachings in general because he advocates a path where only experiential wisdom holds value. And that's not that the shared wisdom of others isn't valuable, but those others should implore you to follow in their footsteps rather than to worship them or accept their authority. You want to find people who will show you how to follow the path rather than those who just ask you to believe what they say about their experience. This is the nature of initiatic knowledge. It's knowledge gained from experience. It's gained by doing, by undergoing a process. Trying to explain what this knowledge is to someone who hasn't experienced it is like trying to explain what the color purple is to a man who's been blind since birth. No amount of describing it will ever be a substitute for actually seeing it. And so it is with this kind of knowledge. Once you've seen for yourself, then you know. You just know. And there's no need for beliefs or dogma or faith. You've experienced it firsthand. It's not a catechism that you need to learn and adhere to and put your trust in. It's a case of, if you follow this path, you will reach this destination. And no one's asking you to believe in the destination. It's just saying, there's the path, walk on it if you want. So there's this, it is this process of the doing in order to know that you can ultimately ascertain what is or is not true, rather than listening to someone else's rational arguments about why you should believe in their experiences. And this is largely why I don't proselytize to anybody. I don't try to tell them what they believe. I don't say, oh, you should be this religion. You're wrong about that. I mean, the only way people will know this stuff is to experience it firsthand themselves. And everyone's at different stages on their journey. So, I don't judge anyway. People can do what they want. But that's kind of the reason why. And it is sort of a modern mentality to want to know everything before you set out on a path to do something. But it is definitely putting the cart before the horse. Okay, that's all I've got for you guys today, and I hope you found that cleared up any questions you had regarding the content in Season 2. As you may have already noticed, we've already begun Season 3, so be sure to check out that new episode if you haven't already, and if you have any burning questions that I didn't answer, or if there was something in this video that you still didn't understand, feel free to drop a comment. I'll do my best to answer. As always, we greatly appreciate any likes and shares, as well as new subscribers. If you want to support the channel financially, there are links in the description for you to do that. But more than anything, we are just really happy to have you here, and it is really so inspiring to us to know that you guys are out there, and we just hope the series will be valuable to you on your own personal journey, whatever that may be. So thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you guys again soon.